Namaste and welcome to another episode of the Dharma podcast. In today's episode, we will narrate the tragic and cruel history of how Dr. Ramesh Chandra Majumdar or R.C. Majumdar, one of the greatest historians that India has ever produced, was cruelly sidelined and hounded out of the history establishment by none other than Nawab Nehru and his cronies immediately after independence. Ramesh Chandra Majumdar's life, it is one of the glorious showcases of a full life lived productively, usefully, in the devoted pursuit of a great ideal, which is the acquisition and pursuit of scholarship and national service. R.C. Majumdar spent his 96 years long life dedicating himself to the freedom struggle of a far profounder, a far more intense sort, which was to rediscover and recover the true history of Bharatavarsha's actual greatness. The outcome of such a great life was a wealth of several magnum opuses totaling nearly 30 volumes, which is apart from hundreds of first-class solid research papers on history and writing even popular newspaper articles. Now, if I have to describe the history of India after independence in a single word, it is this: ingratitude. And nowhere is this ingratitude more evident than in the manner in which the career of this iconic historian, this extraordinary scholar and a profound freedom fighter, was set to fire by India's first Prime Minister Nawab Nehru and his horrible cronies. This episode narrates the full story of that tragedy. Let's begin with a quote. "It is an ominous sign of the time that Indian history is being viewed in official circles in the perspective of recent politics. The official history of the freedom movement starts with the premise that India lost independence only in the 18th century and had thus an experience of subjection to a foreign power for only 2 centuries. Real history, on the other hand, teaches us that the major part of India lost independence about 5 centuries before and merely changed masters in the 18th century." Close quote. This quote is from the same R.C. Majumdar, and he wrote these lines describing the state of history writing in India in the immediate aftermath of attaining freedom from British rule. And this quote appears in the preface to the first volume of his magnificent 3 volumes titled The History of Freedom Movement in India, which was published in 1962. Now, these 3 volumes of the history of freedom movement in India, the story of how they were written, deserves multiple retellings, not in the least because it was deliberately, disgracefully suppressed and buried for more than 60 years by the Marxist villains. More importantly, this story needs multiple retellings for the sake of our children of today and tomorrow. Now, the roots of how R.C. Majumdar was banished from the history writing establishment, the roots of this story, are quite old. It's well known how our Marxists, communists, secularists, progressives, left liberals, basically criminals, anti-nationals wearing different kind of clothes, as simple as that, how they have subverted our history is pretty much well known today. But if you thought that these fellows were the pioneers of this historical insurgency, think again, because much before they had taken absolute control of the system, the rot had already begun to sink in very deep elsewhere. Now let's cut back to the year 1948. In that year, R.C. Majumdar submitted a proposal to the government of India. So in the proposal, he basically said that, let us compile a comprehensive, authentic and truthful history of the freedom struggle. So when the government read through the proposal, it was obviously happy because, you were basking in the afterglow of India's freedom. So the government accepted it. And what happened next in the space of just 1 year is best narrated by another scholar named Dr. B.N. Pandey. He has reviewed R.C. Majumdar's work, The History of the Freedom Movement in India. In his review of volume 1 of this book, this is what he writes. In 1952, the Ministry of Education appointed a board of editors for the compilation of this history. Professor Majumdar was appointed by the board as the director and entrusted with the task of sifting and collecting materials and preparing the draft of history. However, the board, as consisting of politicians and scholars, was least likely to function harmoniously. Perhaps this was a reason why it was dissolved at the end of 1955. Close quote. Here, Dr. Pandey actually gives away one fact, the fact that political interference began right on day one to the obvious detriment of scholarship and history. These are domains which must essentially rest on the foundations of truth, integrity, facts and honesty. And what happened next? Meaning, why this board of editors was suddenly dissolved like this? Dr. Pandey gives the reason, and I quote, "In the first volume, the distinguished author has shown ample courage and sound scholarship in approaching some very controversial and delicate questions. On the question of Hindu-Muslim relationship in pre-British India, he refutes, that is, R.C. Majumdar refutes the commonly held view that the Hindus and Muslims lived in harmony before the advent of British, and that the Hindu-Muslim tension was an outcome of the British policy to divide and rule. These two communities, the author holds, lived as two separate communities with distinct cultures and different mental and moral characteristics. He argues that the Hindu leaders, including Gandhi and Nehru, deliberately ignored the fundamental differences between the Hindus and Muslims and made no serious efforts to tackle the real problem that faced India, namely how to make it possible for two such distinct units to live together as members of one state." Close quote. This was R.C. Majumdar's fundamental and greatest crime, with the result that the board of editors was unceremoniously dissolved, but it was not dissolved. We'll see what happened in a short while. So, Naam ke vaste, this board was dissolved, but the project for writing the history of the freedom movement, that project was very much alive. And Dr. Pandey says that this project remained in balance for 1 year. Matlab, it was in suspended animation. After this, during the course of this 1 year, the government began to look for a person who would head the project, but that person had to essentially toe the government line. Surprise, the government managed to find one such man. He was a bootlicker of Nawab Nehru. He was basically an ICS, Indian Civil Service, Tara Chand. Tarachan was parachuted directly into the education ministry. Now, this man Tarachan absolutely had no formal training or qualification to head a completely academic project like writing the history of the freedom struggle. So, this training, qualification, the rigor, the approach, mindset, a bureaucrat typically can't have this, doesn't have this kind of a mindset. It is best left to great scholars and historians, academics like Dr. R.C. Majumdar. But Tarachan was Nehru's bootlicker. So Tarachan was parachuted into the education ministry. Before that, he was India's ambassador to Tehran from 1951 to 1956. 56 is a year in which Tarachan was pulled into the education ministry, and he was made the head of this project for writing the history of the Indian freedom struggle, which is the official history published by the Government of India, Publications Division, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India. Now, on the other side, R.C. Majumdar, he was naturally upset and disappointed. He was in deep sadness that, such a project had been unceremoniously, dropped like this. But R.C. Majumdar was undeterred and unflinching in his quest to write the most authentic history of the freedom struggle of his own countrymen. He was motivated by a profound desire, by a profound ideal to keep the pains, tears, sacrifices, struggles, the spirit and hopes of the heroes of our Indian freedom struggle alive and fresh. He wanted to preserve the dignity of their heroic memories. And so R.C. Majumdar, the proud son of Bengal and India, Bharata Mata, did not approach this work merely as a project. For him, it was like working towards the same goal with the same spirit that had guided our freedom struggle. Because R.C. Majumdar had lived through that era. He had seen all the great episodes of the Indian freedom struggle. He had lived it as a witness, as a participant, and as a chronicler. To him, writing this history was national patriotic service in the truest sense of the term. So let me read out his own words, what motivated him to undertake such a majestic project. Quote, "I have been a witness to the grim struggle from 1905 to 1947, and I do not pretend to be merely a dispassionate or a disinterested spectator. I would be less than a human being if I were so. Without denying this possibility, I have tried my best to take a detached view. On the other hand, I possess certain advantages in having first-hand knowledge of the important events and impressions and sentiments they left behind on the minds of the people. It is difficult to form a proper idea of these things by a person who, living at a later period, has only to rely on the record of the past in order to reconstruct its history." Tell me, how many historians and scholars of our own time have this kind of integrity, this kind of brutally frank honesty? So, in the next stage of our story, with meager resources, R.C. Majumdar worked all alone, and he completed the majestic 3 volumes of the history of the Indian freedom struggle in just 7 years. The total number of pages of these 3 volumes is more than 2000, or roughly around 2000. And these 3 volumes are still the most comprehensive, the most authoritative, and in many ways unchallenged work on India's freedom struggle. 3 important observations, 3 important insights emerge from this saga of R.C. Majumdar's banishment from the official history establishment. Point number 1 is that the seed for the politicization of the history establishment, these seeds were sown when politicians appointed themselves to a scholarly and academic board. This was a place they had no business to be. Point number 2, the precedent for slaughtering Indian history, the precedent for killing off, for murdering historical facts were set because R.C. Majumdar had openly declared that he would critically examine the roles played by Mohandas Gandhi, Motilal and Jawaharlal Nehru during the freedom struggle. Now this point, along with the truth, along with the hoax of the so-called Hindu-Muslim unity before the British came, this was an absolute taboo, and they would certainly infuriate the first communist Prime Minister of India, Nawab Nehru. In the words of another great scholar who passed away recently, Dr. N.S. Rajaram, this is what he mentions about the episode, and I quote him. What was R.C. Majumdar's crime? He refused to bend history to suit the interest of the Congress party. Close quote. Absolutely true. And so, with this, the stage was set for rampant historical distortions later at the hands of Marxist and communist pamphleteers for the next 50 plus years at all levels, right from primary school to the PhD level. And most of these history distortions, they remain even as I'm recording this podcast. Now we come to the third point, and this third point concerns the timeline of these events. So on the one hand, we have the so-called official project of writing the history of Indian freedom struggle, whose trajectory is as follows. It begins with the dissolution of the board in 1955. Then it is revived in 1956, and the volumes are finally published by the government of India in 1967. That is a total timeline of about 12 or 13 years. And this official project had the complete backing of the government of India, and it had all the resources on demand. Then on the other hand, we have the illustrious example of a dedicated first-rate scholar, a brilliant mind, working alone, who published the grand 3 volumes 5 years before the official version was published. Now this point has an important impact on what I will describe in just a moment. Back then, the education minister, when R.C. Majumdar published submitted his original proposal, the education minister was Nawab Nehru's one of Nawab Nehru's closest chamchas. His name was Maulana Abdul Kalam Azad. Maulana Azad was later succeeded by 3 equally Nehru dynasty chamchas as education ministers. Then it was during the tenure of another dynasty lackey named Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad that Tara Chand's official history of Indian freedom struggle was finally published. So Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad, he was education minister, and he held a formal official ceremony for this book launch. And later, this same Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad was India's president, who signed Indira Gandhi's emergency proclamation. This is the short story of the systematic marginalization and the complete banishment of a towering historian, a great scholar, and a true patriot, which went hand in hand with another deadly impact. This was a construction of a spurious Marxist grand narrative of Indian history, which which is a history that all of us pretty much read. All the generations that were born after, say, the 1960s or the in mid 1950s, this is the official history that we've all read. So it is precisely the teaching of this fraudulent Marxist history to at least 3 generations of our children that we have the dangerous spectacle of the Didi out there in the eastern part of India, who arrested people for simply chanting the mantra of Jai Shri Ram. Or this history is the reason why people no longer bat an eyelid. They don't even express public outrage at the routine abuse and vandalism of Hindu deities, Hindu traditions, customs, and institutions. This is a work. This outcome has been achieved by peddling, by injecting spurious Marxist history in our textbooks at all levels. So let's now get back to the story of R.C. Majumdar. These are reasons, this distorted history and the long-term impact it causes. These are the real reasons that the story of histories of heroes like Dr. R.C. Majumdar and the realities and the politics of his time must be told and retold and retold and retold n number of times. At least now, they must be told at least now, to build a nation, to build a future based on even the harshest of historical truths. So it certainly takes courage, it certainly takes hard work, it is generational work, but it is good to invest in this generational work because the alternative is the physical breakup of the Indian geography. Just think about it. Another important aspect of this tragic story of Dr. R.C. Majumdar's hounding out of the history establishment is this. Our Marxist stenographers, ideologues, they are not historians, are Marxist stenographers who wear the makeup of historians. They would have correctly remained in the fringes had honest scholars like R.C. Majumdar's not been hounded out solely because they did not agree to become Nehru's slaves. This also reveals an important truth about the personality and character of Nawab Nehru. This was a great prime minister who had 3 terms. This great man, this great peace-loving world leader, he felt threatened by an honest assessment of what? Of not him. By an honest portrayal of the history of Indian freedom struggle, of which he was a part and of which he was proud. But then, the truth remains no matter what anybody says. R.C. Majumdar was yet another of the hundreds of Himalayan scholars who were victimized by this insecure autocrat named Nawab Nehru. But in the end, today, R.C. Majumdar and not Nawab Nehru has been vindicated by time as a true hero and a real patriot, and Nawab Nehru's true legacy is a national joke named Rahul Gandhi. So with that, we come to the concluding leg of today's episode. It's interesting how R.C. Majumdar had himself predicted this outcome which we are all witnessing now. So I think it is befitting to conclude this episode by quoting his own words. Quote, it is not unlikely that the views I have expressed may not commend themselves to anyone, and a large section of my countrymen would bitterly resent some of them. But I find consolation in the wise words of one of the greatest Sanskrit poets. There may be somewhere, at some time, somebody who would agree with my views and appreciate them, for time is eternal and the world is wide and large. Desho Vishalaf Prabhavopi Anantaha. And on that profound note, we come to the end of this rather interesting podcast episode. And I once again thank all of you. And please do not forget to like this episode so that our topics reach a wider audience. And do hit the subscribe button and click the bell for receiving notifications for future episodes. And we also make a humble request to contribute whatever you're comfortable with so that we can bring out and offer you more such interesting and informative and in many cases rare episodes drawn from the history and culture of Bharatavarsha. And on that note, thank you all once again. Namaste. Vande Mataram.